May 1942, Aberdeen Proving Ground, Maryland. The morning sun cast long shadows across the testing range as Lieutenant Edward Uhl steadied the 5-foot steel tube against his shoulder. What Army officials would later call one of the war's most revolutionary weapons rested in his hands. At this moment, however, it was nothing more than a wooden rifle stock. Some scrap metal salvaged from a junk pile, and a prayer that the contraption wouldn't explode in his face, Uhl. Only 24 and fresh out of Lehigh University with an engineering degree and Phi Beta Kappa honors, had been wrestling with an impossible problem for weeks. The shaped charge grenade in his possession could penetrate 4 inches of hardened steel. It could, in short, stop any tank the Germans had rolling across Europe. But weighing 3.5 pounds, it couldn't be thrown far enough by any soldier to avoid getting killed by their own target. The Army needed a delivery system, and they needed it yesterday. Crucially, it had to be simple enough that any infantryman could use it without specialized training. Nearby, Captain Leslie Skinner, Uhl's colleague, stood with a clipboard, watching through field glasses as a Mark V tank rumbled into position 300 yards downrange. Recognition of his critical work on what would become one of the war's most important weapons had recently earned Skinner a promotion to major during the development process. A career Army man at 42, he had been experimenting with rockets since his teens. This youthful fascination with explosives had brought him to this moment and to this weapon that would change infantry warfare forever. Despite the time he accidentally set fire to a hospital roof at Fort Strong, Massachusetts, back in 1915, a deed for which his father, an army surgeon, had been less than pleased. The generals gathering behind them had no idea they were about to witness history. Among them was Brigadier General Gladian Marcus Barnes, Chief of Research and Development for Army Ordnance. Headquarters had dismissively called the project Skinner's Toy Rocket, and Barnes had reluctantly agreed to observe this demonstration. The Army had urgent, real problems to solve. American forces were woefully unprepared for the mechanized warfare sweeping across North Africa and Europe. While German panzer divisions rolled through Poland, France, and deep into Russia, American infantry had essentially nothing that could stop a tank. Soldiers were being trained to run up and stick magnetic mines on enemy armor. The mortality rate for such tactics was predictably catastrophic. The weapon Uhl hefted looked absurd. A simple tube open at both ends with makeshift sights fabricated that very morning from a bent wire coat hanger. Inside rested a thinned rocket with the shaped charge warhead. The firing mechanism consisted of a dry cell battery and a trigger salvaged from various sources. Everything about it screamed desperate improvisation, yet nothing about it suggested military precision. Months of frustration, failure, and finally breakthrough were represented by this crude assembly. Decades in the making, the rocket pioneer, the story of how Uhl and Skinner created what would become known as the bazooka begins not in 1942, but decades earlier in the mind of an American rocket pioneer whose work had been dismissed as fantasy. Robert Goddard had developed rocket-powered weapons during World War I, creating prototypes that could theoretically give infantry portable firepower against fortifications. Interest evaporated when the armistice was signed in November 1918. Why invest in experimental rockets when the war to end all wars had concluded? For 20 years, the research gathered dust in War Department archives. By 1940, with German tanks crushing France and Poland, those archives suddenly seemed relevant again. Skinner, stationed at Indian Head Rocket Laboratory in Maryland, began pulling Goddard's old research. The science was sound. Solid fuel rockets could deliver explosive payloads with minimal recoil. The challenge wasn't propulsion. It was creating a warhead powerful enough to penetrate modern tank armor and a launcher simple enough for mass production. The shaped charge principle had been known since the 1880s. When Charles Monroe discovered that explosives with hollow cavities focused their destructive force into a narrow jet. By 1941, American ordnance engineers had refined this into the M10-shaped charge grenade. Tests showed it could burn through armor like a blowtorch. There was one problem. It weighed too much to throw effectively, and mounting it on a rifle barrel risked injury to the fire from the explosive backblast. Skinner sketched a tube-launched rocket system in December 1940. His superiors told him there was no suitable warhead. Suddenly, the impossible seemed merely improbable when the M10 arrived in 1942. Skinner assigned the launcher development to Uhl, who had joined his Special Projects Unit in June 1941. For weeks, Uhl experimented with different configurations: how to shield the operator from rocket exhaust, how to stabilize the projectile in flight, and how to make sights accurate enough for combat ranges. The breakthrough came by accident, as many great inventions do. Uhl was walking past a scrap pile at the laboratory when he spotted a steel tube, approximately 5 feet long and 60 millimeters in diameter. Something clicked. He picked it up, held it to his shoulder, and realized it was almost exactly the same diameter as the M10 grenade. The rocket could sit inside the tube. The open rear would vent the exhaust away from the operator. Put a rocket in a tube, point it at a tank, pull a trigger. The fundamental concept was elegantly direct. Uhl rushed back to the workshop. Within hours, he had fabricated a crude prototype using the salvaged tube, some wood from spare rifle stocks, and basic grips and trigger mechanisms. The first test would be crucial. If the rocket exploded in the tube, the project was dead. If the backblast was too severe, the weapon would be unusable. Uhl carried his creation down to the Petioak River, far from any observers who might question his sanity. He loaded a rocket, pointed the tube across the water, and squeezed the trigger. The rocket whooshed out with surprising grace. There was no violent recoil, no burst of flame in his face, just a smooth launch and a splash in the river hundreds of feet away. Uhl was stunned. He had expected to need protective equipment, maybe a blast shield. But the rocket's propellant burned completely within the tube's length, and what little exhaust escaped vented harmlessly out the rear. A soldier could fire this from his shoulder without injury. He brought the prototype to Skinner the next morning. Together, they refined the design, adding proper sights, improving the trigger mechanism, and ensuring the electrical firing system could function in combat conditions. They fabricated dummy rockets for safety testing. Everything performed beyond expectations. Now they needed to prove it to the brass, the demonstration. And the nickname, the demonstration, at Aberdeen Proving Ground was hastily arranged for May 1942. The Army was conducting trials of various spigot mortars, bulky, crew-served weapons that also used shaped charges. Skinner saw an opportunity. He and Uhl would demonstrate their launcher alongside these established systems. The comparison would either validate their work or expose it as inadequate. As the visiting generals arrived that morning, Skinner realized they had forgotten one critical detail. The launcher had no sights. The wire coat hanger sights had been a last-minute improvisation, bent into shape with a broken nail just hours earlier. No careful calibration, no precision instruments. Just a rough approximation of where the rocket might go. The demonstration began with the spigot mortars. 5 different models were tested against the moving tank. Each crew fired multiple rounds, but not a single hit was recorded. The mortars were accurate enough against stationary targets, but tracking a moving vehicle proved beyond their capabilities. The generals looked disappointed but unsurprised. Anti-tank weapons were notoriously difficult to aim under field conditions. Then it was Skinner and Uhl's turn. Skinner shouldered the launcher, tracking the tank as it rumbled across the range. He squeezed the trigger. The rocket leaped from the tube with a distinctive whoosh. Seconds later, it struck the tank's hull with a resounding clang. The generals stirred with interest. Perhaps a lucky shot. Skinner fired again. Another hit. And again. And again. With their improvised wire coat hanger sights and a weapon assembled from scrap metal, Skinner and Uhl repeatedly hit the moving tank, while 5 sophisticated mortars had scored 0 hits. General Barnes stepped forward, fascination evident on his weathered face. The man had seen countless weapons demonstrations over 3 decades of military service, but this one was different. He turned to Skinner with a request that was really in order. "Let me try it." Skinner handed over the launcher. Walking Barnes through the simple firing procedure. Aim, track the target, squeeze the trigger. Nothing complicated. No lengthy training required. Barnes settled the tube against his shoulder, squinted through the crude sights, and fired. Direct hit. The general's face split into a rare smile. He looked at the launcher, then at Skinner, then back at the weapon. The words that came out of his mouth would become Army legend. "It sure looks like Bob Burns' bazooka." Bob Burns was one of America's most popular comedians in the 1930s and early 1940s. His trademark prop was a bizarre musical instrument of his own creation, a long tube that produced comical sounds when blown. He called it a bazooka. The name stuck to the musical instrument and, moments later, to the weapon that would terrify German tank crews across 3 continents. Barnes wasn't just making a joke. He was christening a weapon that would become synonymous with infantry anti-tank warfare for the next 3 decades. Rush to production and North Africa. Failure that very day, with rocket smoke still hanging in the air on the Aberdeen range. Barnes provided a favorable report that led to immediate orders for 5,000 launches into production. Not 5,000 for testing, but 5,000 for combat deployment. A few days later at Camp Sims, D.C., General George C. Marshall witnessed a demonstration before high-ranking war and Navy officials, Allied government observers, and British and Russian military observers. Marshall immediately issued verbal orders for 5,000 launchers and 25,000 anti-tank rockets, plus 5,000 practice rockets. General Electric received the contract on May 20, 1942. With an impossible deadline, 30 days to deliver 5,000 launchers. The clock started immediately at GE's Bridgeport, Connecticut facilities. Engineers worked around the clock reverse engineering Skinner and Uhl's prototype. The design was straightforward, which made it ideal for mass production. Steel tube, wooden stock, basic trigger mechanism, simple battery-powered ignition. Nothing exotic, nothing that required specialized manufacturing, just competent metalwork and woodworking at scale. The official designation was Launcher Rocket 2.36 in anti-tank M1, but from the factory floor to the front lines, nobody called it that. It was the Bazooka. General Electric delivered the order with 89 minutes to spare. 5,000 bazookas. Manufactured in 1 month, ready for deployment. The weapon received formal designation on June 14, 1942, e.g. Bud Company manufactured the initial 25,000 M6 anti-tank rockets and 5,000 M7 practice rockets, but having the launcher was only half the equation. The rocket itself, designated M6, proved troublesome. Early production rockets suffered from horrific reliability problems. Primers failed to ignite. Fins bent during transport, and propellant charges burned inconsistently, too quickly in hot weather, risking tube burst and too slowly in cold weather, scorching the gunner's face. The shaped charge warhead worked perfectly in laboratory conditions, but proved temperamental in the field. The electrical ignition was problematic in wet and cold climates, and the contact ring system caused structural weakness in the rocket. When the M6 worked, it was devastating. When it didn't, it was useless. This would become painfully apparent in the weapon's combat debut. November 8, 1942. The beaches of North Africa gleamed under the intense Mediterranean sun as Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of French North Africa, commenced. Over 100,000 American and British troops hit beaches at Casablanca, Oran, and Algiers simultaneously. It was America's first major offensive operation of the war. Among the forces landing were units equipped with the new M1 Bazookas. The night before the landings, November 7, 1942, Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower was shocked to learn that none of his troops had received any training on the new weapon. Bazookas had been rushed to North Africa so quickly that many soldiers first saw them when crates were pried open on transport ships. No manuals, no instructors, no practice ammunition, just a tube and some rockets with vague assurances that it could stop tanks. The initial North African fighting was chaotic. French colonial forces loyal to Vichy resisted with unexpected ferocity, and German troops rushed reinforcements to Tunisia. American forces, untested in combat, struggled with coordination, leadership, and equipment they barely understood. The bazooka saw little to no meaningful combat use during the torch landings themselves. The weapon that had performed brilliantly at Aberdeen was failing before it even reached the battlefield. The first documented combat use occurred during the Tunisia campaign that followed. The 168th Infantry Regiment of the 34th Infantry Division received their first shipment of bazookas on February 12, 1943, and soldiers learned to use them against German armor attacks on February 14, 1943, under the worst possible circumstances. The bazooka's performance in the Tunisian fighting was dismal. The unreliable M6 rockets misfired constantly. Soldiers who had never trained with the weapon couldn't judge distances or leading angles for moving targets. The electrical firing system proved vulnerable to moisture and rough handling. Battery contacts corroded in the salt air. Rocket propellant absorbed humidity, burning incompletely or not at all. After months of combat in Tunisia, Army ordnance officers compiled a disturbing assessment. An American general visiting the Tunisian front in 1943, after the close of combat operations, could not find any soldiers who could report that the weapon had actually stopped an enemy tank. Not a single verified tank kill could be attributed to the bazooka. Soldiers reported firing at enemy armor only to watch rockets bounce off, fail to detonate, or miss entirely. In May 1943, the Army suspended further deployment of the M1 Bazooka. The entire program seemed on the verge of cancellation. Millions of dollars had been invested in a weapon that couldn't accomplish its primary mission. The second chance, Sicily and improvement, but Skinner, Uhl, and the ordnance engineers at Aberdeen refused to give up. They began methodically addressing each failure point. The rocket was redesigned as the M6A1 with a new contact system using wire unspooled from the rear, replacing the nose contact ring that had created structural weakness. Propellant sticks were shortened, reducing peak pressures. The fuse and electrical ignition were improved. The launcher became the M1A1 with a simplified design that eliminated the forward hand grip, added a face guard at the hand position, included a conical muzzle deflector and carrying strap, revised the safety mechanism, and reduced weight from 18 pounds to just 12.34 pounds. The simplified sighting device had 100 to 300-yard range graduations. Most importantly, soldiers began receiving actual training. Target ranges were established where troops could fire practice rounds. Tactics were developed for two-man teams with a gunner and a loader working in coordination. By summer 1943, an improved weapon and better trained soldiers were ready for another chance. The testing ground would be Sicily. July 10, 1943, Operation Husky, the Allied invasion of Sicily, launched with over 180,000 troops storming Sicilian beaches. Among them were American paratroopers of the 82nd Airborne Division carrying the improved M1 Bazookas into combat. Colonel James Gavin, commanding the 505th Parachute Infantry Regimental Combat Team, had trained his men extensively with the new weapon. Unlike the rushed deployment in North Africa, these soldiers knew what they were doing. They understood the bazooka's capabilities and limitations. They had practiced hitting moving targets. They were ready. Gavin later wrote in American Heritage magazine that the bazookas were most important since they were the only weapons the troopers were carrying that would enable them to engage the German armor on reasonable terms. The 82nd drop was a disaster, with high winds scattering paratroopers across 50 miles of Sicilian countryside. Gavin landed far from his intended drop zone, gathering a handful of men and moving toward the sound of fighting. By dawn on July 11, 1943, scattered groups of American paratroopers found themselves defending a ridge line called Biazza Ridge against elements of the German Hermann Göring Panzer Division. Tiger I tanks, Panzer IV medium tanks, an armored artillery battalion, and approximately 700 infantry advanced toward the American positions. The paratroopers were scattered, outgunned and outnumbered, but they had bazookas. The first American soldiers to engage the German armor fired their bazookas at the Tiger tank frontal armor. The rockets struck with tremendous impact, then bounced off harmlessly. The shaped charge warheads couldn't penetrate the Tiger's thick frontal plates. This was a known limitation, but in the chaos of combat, with 60-ton monsters bearing down on their positions, some soldiers panicked. Gavin later wrote that their bazooka rounds simply bounced off the armor plating of the big 60-ton Tigers, which replied with 88mm cannon fire. He noted that many bazooka teams had had pieces of bazookas ground up in them by tanks as they were crushed during the vulnerable loading and firing sequences. But seasoned NCOs kept their heads. They had been trained to target weak spots, side armor, rear engine compartments, tank tracks. As Tigers maneuvered to bring their 88mm main guns to bear, American bazooka teams shifted position, seeking angle shots. The battle raged through the long, brutal day at Biazza Ridge. Naval gunfire from USS destroyers with 155mm guns proved decisive, along with the arrival of Sherman tanks. Lieutenant Harold H. Swingingler, commander of Service Company 505 PIR and a former intercollegiate boxing champion, arrived at approximately 1900 hours with Sherman tanks and approximately 50 men from Regimental Headquarters Company. He captured the first Tiger tank intact by killing the crew with a hand grenade when they were outside the vehicle. Swingingler was later killed in action on D-Day, June 6, 1944. By evening, the German attack had stalled. The Hermann Göring division withdrew, having suffered losses. At least one Tiger was captured intact, and Germans withdrew, leaving equipment behind. For the broader Sicily campaign that continued through August 17, 1943, M1 bazookas are credited with destroying 4 medium German tanks and 1 Tiger I. The Tiger kill was described in military histories as achieved through an improbable hit, reportedly through the driver's vision slot. Gavin's after-action report praised the bazooka's effectiveness when properly employed by trained soldiers against appropriate targets. The weapon had proven itself when used correctly. News of Sicily's success spread rapidly through American forces. Soldiers who had been skeptical after North Africa began requesting bazookas for their units. Training became standardized across all divisions. Tactics were refined and codified. The bazooka was no longer an experimental weapon. It was standard infantry equipment, German copy, and the final models. The most significant impact, however, was on the enemy. German intelligence officers, interrogating captured American soldiers in Tunisia in early 1943, had first learned about the bazooka. Additional examples were captured in late 1942 on the Eastern Front from Soviet Red Army forces, who had received them through Lend-Lease, and more were captured in February 1943 during continued Tunisian fighting. German ordnance experts examined these specimens with great interest. The shaped charge warhead was sophisticated, using principles German scientists understood well, but the delivery system was brilliantly direct in its approach. The Germans immediately began developing their own version. By 1943, German troops were using the Raketenpanzerbüchse 43, with the improved RPZB-54 model, entering service in February 1944. Nicknamed the Panzerschreck, or Tank Terror, and officially designated Ofenrohr, or stovepipe, due to the copious smoke it produced. The weapon was essentially a scaled-up bazooka. It increased the warhead diameter from 60 mm to 88 mm, enabling armor penetration of 160 to 230 mm, roughly double the American bazooka's 76 to 102 mm capability. The Germans had copied the design so closely that American soldiers could recognize it immediately. But the Panzerschreck had significant drawbacks. Unlike American bazooka rockets, which burned their propellant completely within the launch tube, Panzerschreck rockets continued burning for 2 meters after leaving the muzzle. This created an enormous backblast that could seriously burn the operator. German soldiers had to wear protective ponchos, heavy gloves, and gas masks without filters when firing. Later models added a blast shield, but this made the weapon heavier at 24 pounds compared to the M1A1's 13 pounds. In combat, that weight difference mattered enormously. American bazooka teams could move quickly, take a shot, and relocate before enemy forces could react. Panzerschreck teams, burdened with protective equipment and a heavier weapon, were less mobile. The massive backblast also created enormous smoke clouds, revealing the shooter's position to every enemy within visual range. Approximately 300,000 Panzerschrecks were produced during the war. As 1943 turned to 1944, the bazooka underwent continuous improvement. The M9 model, introduced in October 1943, featured a 2-piece design that broke down for easier transport, crucial for airborne operations. The assembled length was 61 inches, disassembled 31.5 inches. Weight was approximately 15.87 pounds unloaded. Metal furniture replaced wood. Most significantly, a new Magnavox T6 trigger magneto replaced the troublesome battery ignition system, eliminating countless malfunctions. The General Electric T43 aperture sight was replaced in September 1944 with the Polaroid T90 optical reflector sight. Rate of fire increased to 10 rounds per minute. Production totaled 26,087 M9 units. The improved M9A1 was introduced in June 1944 with better coupling mechanisms for the launch tubes. This became the most numerous variant, with 277,119 units produced by war's end. Most importantly, the M6A3 rocket entered production in late 1943 with a blunt hemispherical nose that prevented deflection off sloped armor. The new circular fin assembly improved flight stability. More effective shaped charge standoff and improved propellant made it more reliable across temperature ranges. This rocket could penetrate 3.5 to 4 inches, 89 to 102 millimeters, of armor plate reliably at effective ranges of 250 to 300 yards. Soldiers who had cursed the bazooka's early unreliability now praised its effectiveness. The weapon became particularly valuable in the Italian campaign, where mountainous terrain favored defensive positions and made tank warfare difficult. American infantry advancing through valleys faced machine gun nests, mortar positions, and dug-in armor in prepared positions. Bazookas proved ideal for this environment. The weapon could engage fortifications at ranges up to 300 yards, far beyond grenade-throwing distance. High-explosive anti-tank rounds destroyed machine gun positions and light vehicles. The versatility exceeded original design parameters. At Cassino in early 1944, where Allied forces battered themselves against German defenses for months, bazookas were used more often against fortifications than against tanks. A rocket that could blow a hole through 4 inches of steel plate could also demolish reinforced concrete emplacements. D-Day and the legacy of Bazooka Charlie. But the bazooka's greatest test came on June 6, 1944, D-Day. American forces storming Omaha Beach carried bazookas ashore in the first waves. Under intense German fire, with men dying by the hundreds in the surf and on the sand, bazooka teams advanced toward German strongpoints. The weapons proved crucial for reducing fortified positions that had pinned down entire companies. Engineers used bazookas to blast paths through obstacles. Infantry used them to suppress machine gun bunkers long enough for flamethrower teams to close in. In the weeks following D-Day, as Allied forces pushed through the Norman Bocage country, bazookas became essential for dealing with German armor ambushing from concealed positions. The thick hedge of Normandy created a claustrophobic battlefield where combat occurred at ranges measured in yards, not hundreds of yards. In this environment, the bazooka's portable firepower was life-saving. But German armor was evolving. The Panther tank's sloped frontal armor could deflect even improved M6A3 rockets at anything but point-blank range. Tigers remained nearly impervious from the front. American soldiers learned to work in teams, with riflemen suppressing enemy infantry while bazooka teams maneuvered for side shots. General George Patton, commanding 3rd Army, wrote that the purpose of the bazooka was to be used as a last resort in keeping tanks from overrunning infantry. With range held to around 30 yards, less than 100 feet. At that distance, a tank's machine guns could shred a bazooka team in seconds. The mortality rate among bazooka operators was sobering. Men assigned to anti-tank duty knew they were being asked to advance toward enemy armor that could kill them from hundreds of yards away. Yet volunteers never lacked. One of the war's most remarkable bazooka stories involves Lieutenant Colonel Charles M. Carpenter, born August 29, 1912, in rural Illinois. Carpenter grew up in Reynolds near Edgington. His family lost their farm during the Great Depression. He worked as a history teacher at Mullen High School before the war, educated on scholarships at Roosevelt Military Academy and Center College, Kentucky. He enlisted in 1942 as a second lieutenant, completed flight training with artillery liaison wings, and arrived in France in 1944, assigned to the 4th Armored Division, General George Patton's 3rd Army, as an artillery spotter and reconnaissance pilot. Carpenter flew an L-4 Grasshopper observation plane, serial number 4330426, which he nicknamed Rosie the Rocketer, in homage to Rosie the Riveter. He mounted 6 M1A1 bazookas, later upgraded to M9 models, 3 launchers per side, on plywood boards fixed to outboard wing struts. Total weight when loaded was approximately 106 pounds. He wired them to the cockpit with an electrical firing system, installing a control panel with push-button switches, allowing individual or salvo firing. Carpenter typically flew solo to maximize performance. His attack profile involved diving from altitude to approximately 100 meters above target, firing rockets, then pulling up steeply to escape return fire. The plunging fire attacked the thinner top armor of tanks, which measured 40 to 45 meter on Tiger, turret tops versus 100 millimeter or more frontal armor. Carpenter is officially credited with destroying 6 tanks, including 2 Tiger Y heavy tanks. Witness accounts claim 14 tanks destroyed, but the official number stands at 6. His first major success came on September 20, 1944, at the Battle of Taejon, where he was credited with destroying 1 German armored car and 4 tanks in a single day across 3 sorties, firing 16 rockets. In October 1944, he destroyed 4 additional tanks and an armored truck. Carpenter received the Silver Star awarded by General George S. Patton for gallantry in ground action. The Bronze Star Medal, Air Medal with Oak Leaf Cluster, European African Middle Eastern Campaign Medal with 4 campaign stars, American Campaign Medal, and World War II Victory Medal. He was featured in Stars and Stripes, Associated Press Popular Science in February 1945, The New York Sun, and Liberty magazine. In Stars and Stripes, he was quoted saying, "Word must be getting around to watch out for Cubs with bazookas on them. Every time I show up now, they shoot with everything they have. They never used to bother Cubs. Bazookas must be bothering them a bit." Carpenter was diagnosed with Hodgkin's lymphoma in 1946 and given a 2-year prognosis. He returned to teaching at Urbana High School, Illinois, and lived until March 22, 1966, approximately 19 years beyond his prognosis. His aircraft, Rosie the Rocketer, serial 4330426, was restored and has been displayed at the American Heritage Museum in Hudson, Massachusetts since 2020. His daughter, Carol Carpenter Axtell, co-authored a 2020 biography, Bazooka Charlie, the unbelievable story of Major Charles Carpenter and Rosie the Rocketer, heroic deeds and Pacific challenges. Other remarkable accounts of the bazooka emerged from the war. On December 21, 1944, near Malmedy, Belgium, Private First Class Francis Sherman Currey of Company K, 120th Infantry Regiment, 31st Infantry Division, earned the Medal of Honor. German tanks overran American positions, forcing Currey and 5 other soldiers to withdraw into an abandoned factory. Finding a bazooka there but no ammunition, Currey ran across the street under heavy fire to secure rockets from an abandoned half-track. His Medal of Honor citation reads that Sergeant Currey found a bazooka in the building and crossed the street to secure rockets, meanwhile enduring intense fire from enemy tanks and hostile infantrymen who had taken up a position at a house a short distance away. In the face of small arms, machine gun, and artillery fire, he with a companion knocked out a tank with 1 shot. Currey later called it a miracle, stating the rocket hit the exact spot where the turret joined the chassis and disabled the vehicle. Currey gave multiple interviews throughout his life, which lasted until October 8, 2019. First Lieutenant Waverly Wright, Deacon Ray of Company D, 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment, 82nd Airborne Division, led a bazooka team against German positions near a railway bridge in Normandy in June 1944. When their rounds fell short, he took the bazooka himself and moved closer to get within effective range. He was struck by machine gun fire and died of his wounds. Lieutenant Colonel Van der Voort considered Ray the 82nd Airborne Division's undiscovered World War II equivalent of Sergeant Alvin C. York. Meanwhile, on December 19, 1944, near Stoumont, Belgium, Albert Durago, a 19-year-old member of a 90mm anti-aircraft gun crew, volunteered with Roland Seaman after Brass sought volunteers to go after German tanks. Durago had never fired a bazooka before. In a 2014 Washington Post interview at age 89, he recalled, "I knew I was going to get it before I got down there. But God was with me. After hitting one of 4 German tanks backed by infantry, he said, 'I pulled the trigger, and you never heard such a racket and noise when that thing hit. I heard them hollering and screaming.' The lieutenant asked him to make sure, and he went down again with a reloaded weapon." Wilbur Bill Bruner, serving with Army engineers, used his M9 Bazooka in 1945 near Dortmund, Germany, to destroy a German half-track blocking Autobahn underpasses. In a 2004 oral history, he stated, "It must have had ammunition because it blew, I'd say, 100 feet in the air, but it blew up. I was glad we weren't any closer than we were." The Jagdtiger No. 134, the heaviest armored fighting vehicle in World War II at 79 tons, was struck on January 4, 1945, during Operation Nordwind near Rimling, France in Alsace. It was hit in the vulnerable side armor by either a bazooka or an M36 tank destroyer, causing an ammunition detonation that killed the entire crew. This marked the first Jagdtiger lost in combat. Despite 250mm frontal armor that was practically invulnerable, the side armor measured only 80mm. During the Battle of the Bulge on December 17th to 18th, 1944, at the twin villages of Krinkelt-Rocherath and the crossroads of La Glaise in the Ardennes, bazookas accounted for knocking out over 20 German armored vehicles. While not the deciding factor in the American ability to hold these key points, it demonstrated the weapon's effectiveness in desperate close combat. The Pacific Theater and production scale. In the Pacific Theater, the bazooka faced different challenges. Japanese tanks were lighter and more thinly armored than German vehicles, making them easier targets. However, Japanese defensive tactics emphasized caves, bunkers, and fortified positions rather than mobile armored warfare. American Marines and Army troops used bazookas primarily against these fortifications. The weapon proved ideal for destroying Japanese pillboxes without requiring soldiers to close to suicidal ranges. White phosphorus rockets were particularly effective against bunkers and caves, as the burning phosphorus created toxic smoke that forced defenders out into the open. On Iwo Jima and Okinawa, bazooka teams worked closely with flamethrower units, using rockets to blow open fortified positions that flamethrowers then cleared. The Pacific's climate posed unique problems. Heat and humidity wreaked havoc on the electrical systems in M1 and M1A1 models of the bazooka. Soldiers experienced frequent misfires. The rubber grips deteriorated rapidly, and metal components corroded despite protective coatings. The M9's magneto ignition proved more reliable than the earlier battery system, but problems persisted. By war's end in August 1945, American forces had accumulated vast experience with shoulder-fired rocket launchers. From June 1942 through May 1945, American industry manufactured 476,628 bazookas of all models. The production breakdown was M1 112-790 units, June 1942, August 1943, M1A1 59,932 units, July-October 1943 N9 26,087 units, October 1943, June 1944 N9A1 27819 units, June 1944, May 1945 M18 500 units, April-August 1945, of which only 350 saw combat. General Electric produced approximately 91.6% of all bazookas. Cheney Bigelow Wireworks of Springfield, Massachusetts, manufactured approximately 40,000 M9A1 launchers under a June 1944 contract, winning the Army-Navy E Award 3 times. Rocket production was even more impressive, with 15,630,000 rounds manufactured by war's end, including all types such as heat, practice, and smoke variants. The weapon's design made it ideal for the rapid training of Allied forces. Free French forces received 11,350 units, becoming the largest foreign operator. The Soviet Union received approximately 3,000 units through Lend-Lease, though they held them in low regard compared to anti-tank rifles. Brazil received approximately 2,900 units, the United Kingdom 2,100 units, China 2,000 units, Canada approximately 170 units, and Czechoslovak insurgents received 162 units via airlift during the Slovak National Uprising in September-October 1944. The rise of the Super Bazooka A's, the war entered its final months. A troubling reality emerged. German tanks were becoming increasingly difficult to kill with the 2.36-inch bazooka. The Panther's sloped armor was resistant even to side shots unless taken at optimal angles. And the Tiger II, introduced in late 1944, was essentially impervious to bazookas except at the rear. American ordnance engineers recognized the problem. In October 1944, after examining captured German Panzerschrecks, work began on a completely redesigned weapon designated the M20 Super Bazooka. The M20 featured an 88.9mm, 3.5-inch caliber, matching the German weapon's diameter. The launcher was constructed of two-piece aluminum alloy, measured 60 inches assembled, or approximately 33 inches disassembled, and weighed 14.3 pounds unloaded. It featured a magneto-type firing device in the trigger grip and a reflecting optical sight. The M28A2 rocket could penetrate 11 inches, 280 meters of armor, nearly double the 2.36-inch version's capability. Effective range was 150 meters against moving targets and 275 to 300 meters against stationary targets, with a rate of fire of 6 rounds per minute. The M20 was designated in late 1944, with small-scale production beginning in 1948. Critically, the M20 saw no combat use in World War II. Development came too late. The war in Europe ended in May 1945 before the weapon could be deployed to combat units. In the Pacific, where Japanese tanks were lighter and the fighting focused more on fortifications, the original 2.36-inch bazooka remained adequate through Japan's surrender in August 1945. The Korean War and the M20's debut, that expertise would prove valuable sooner than anyone expected. 5 years later, on June 25, 1950, North Korean forces, equipped with approximately 150 Soviet-supplied T-34-85 tanks, poured across the 38th parallel into South Korea. American forces, caught unprepared and under strength, desperately needed weapons to stop them. South Korea had 1958 M9A1 2.36-inch bazookas, their only anti-tank weapons in quantity. They proved critically ineffective against the T-34-85's frontal armor, which measured 90 to 100 mm on July 5, 1950. Task Force Smith, consisting of 406 U.S. soldiers, faced approximately 5,000 North Koreans, supported by 33 to 36 T-34-85 tanks. Armed with 6 M9A1 bazookas, they fired 22 rockets with zero effect on the T-34s. The rockets literally bounced off the tank armor. The task force was routed. Colonel Robert Martin of the 24th Infantry Division was killed on July 8, 1950, attempting to stop a T-34 with a 2.36-inch bazooka. On July 8, 1950, day 13 of the war, General Douglas MacArthur requested urgent shipment of the M20 Super Bazooka. Rock Island Arsenal shipped the first M20s to Korea, accompanied by instructors from Fort Benning. Training manuals were hastily written in just 2 weeks. The first combat use occurred at the Battle of Taejon on July 20, 1950, when the 24th Infantry Division received the first consignment. The results were immediate and dramatic. The M20 was credited with destroying 8 T-34 tanks on its first day of combat use. Time magazine reported it knocked out 7 tanks in 7 tries. Major General William F. Dean personally used the M20 against T-34s during the battle, engaging a T-34 from a second-story window at less than 10 yards range.
He hit the turret ring, set the tank on fire, and killed the crew.
Of 10 T-34s in the city that day, 6 were destroyed by M20s and 2 by artillery. Dean was later awarded the Medal of Honor, the first of the Korean War, for actions including his bazooka use. He was captured after the battle and held as a prisoner of war until September 1953. Over 750 M20s were produced and shipped to Korea in the first year. The improved M20A1 entered service in 1952 with an improved connector latch assembly and became the main production version. The M20B1 featured a cast aluminum barrel and simplified internals for lighter weight, and the M20A1B1 combined the M20B1 features with M2A1 improvements. Throughout the Korean War, the Super Bazooka proved its worth, destroying hundreds of enemy tanks and fortifications, obsolescence and enduring legacy, but even the M20 was approaching obsolescence. Tank armor continued to improve, and shaped charge warheads required ever larger diameters to maintain penetration capability. The reloadable bazooka, which required a 2-man team and multiple rockets, was giving way to single-use disposable launchers. By the mid-1960s, as American forces deployed to Vietnam, the bazooka era was ending. The M72 Law, light anti-armor weapon, offered similar capability in a package 1/3 the weight, requiring only 1 soldier with no reloading. The bazooka soldiered on in limited use through the early years of Vietnam, particularly against fortified positions, but gradually faded from American arsenals. Yet the concept Skinner and Uhl pioneered in 1942 remains fundamental to modern infantry warfare. Every army on Earth fields shoulder-fired rocket launchers descended from the bazooka, the AT-4. The RPG-7, the M136, the Panzerfaust III, and dozens of modern weapons all trace their lineage to that crude tube Uhl spotted on a scrap pile. The shaped charge warhead remains the primary method for defeating tank armor at infantry ranges. The psychological impact was as important as the technical specifications. Before 1942, tanks were nearly invulnerable to individual infantrymen. The bazooka changed that calculation. Suddenly, 2 men with 50 pounds of equipment could destroy a 50-ton vehicle. Tank crews could no longer ignore infantry. This fundamentally altered tactical doctrine, making combined arms doctrine absolutely essential. Tanks operating without infantry cover were suicidally vulnerable. Corporal Donald E. Lewis, who participated in armor penetration tests involving a German Panther tank using both the German RPZ-B-54 Panzerschreck and the US M9 Bazooka, stated, "I was so favorably impressed by the Panzerschreck. I was ready to take after the Krauts with their own weapon." He informed superiors that the Panzerschreck was far superior to the American bazooka, demonstrating that American forces recognized the limitations of their weapon even as they used it effectively. When Leslie Skinner died on November 2, 1978, at age 78, obituaries across America credited him with co-inventing one of World War II's most influential weapons. After the war, he had a distinguished career, including a recall for the Korean War where he established a weapons test facility for the U.S. Air Force. Following his second retirement, he worked as a consultant before moving to Florida and taking up sculpture, channeling his creative energy into art. He was buried at Arlington National Cemetery. Edward Uhl lived longer, passing away on May 9, 2010, at age 92. After leaving the U.S. Army as a lieutenant colonel in 1947, he worked for Glenn L. Martin Company and later Martin Marietta on guided missile projects, eventually becoming vice president of engineering. His career continued to flourish at Ryan Aeronautical Company and then at Fairchild Industries, where he served as president and then chairman from 1961 to 1985, overseeing its transformation into an aerospace Fortune 500 company. In interviews during his final years, Uhl maintained that the bazooka's success came from necessity and direct problem-solving. "We really had no anti-tank weapon," he told Maryland Cracker Barrel magazine in 2007. "You can't believe how inept our military was at that point in time." That statement carried weight. The American military of 1941 was woefully unprepared for modern warfare. By 1945, it was the most powerful military force in human history. Weapons like the bazooka made that transformation possible. In 1985, at a reunion in Germany for veterans of the European campaign, a remarkable moment occurred. A former German Panther tank commander approached an American veteran who had carried a bazooka through France and Germany. Through a translator, the German said, "We feared your tube rocket more than your tanks. Your Sherman tanks we could destroy easily, but your rockets, they came from anywhere. From soldiers we could not see until too late." He explained that they often abandoned tanks that were not damaged just because they heard the sound of the rockets nearby. The American asked why. The German smiled sadly, saying, "Because we knew that the next rocket might come through our vision slot or strike our engine or catch us from behind. We were always looking over our shoulders. The fear was worse than the weapon." This psychological impact, the constant threat perception, was perhaps the bazooka's greatest achievement. German tank crews who had terrorized Europe suddenly became the terrorized. The bazooka's influence extended beyond the battlefield. The shaped charge warhead principle became foundational for mining, demolition work, and industrial cutting. The rocket propulsion systems developed for the bazooka informed post-war missile development, with engineers bringing that expertise to guided missile programs in the 1950s and 1960s. French resistance fighters found bazookas invaluable for ambushing German convoys, requiring minimal training for partisan forces who couldn't establish formal training programs. By the 21st century, shoulder-fired rocket launchers have evolved far beyond anything Skinner and Uhl could have imagined. Yet soldiers still call them bazookas. The term has become generic, referring to an entire category of weapons. Modern military historians studying the bazooka's development often note what didn't happen. No committee review process, no multi-year development program, no extensive field trials before deployment, just a weapon that worked well enough, manufactured quickly enough, and distributed widely enough to matter. The bazooka cost perhaps $50 to manufacture, and any infantryman could maintain it. The crews who manufactured bazookas at General Electric and other contractors were predominantly women, part of the Rosie the Riveter phenomenon. Quality control took on moral dimensions, and rejection rates for defective components were remarkably low. Despite rushed production schedules, the bazooka gave infantry a capability they didn't have before, and that tool saved lives. Soldiers facing German armor no longer had to rely on desperate measures like running up to tanks with explosive charges. They could engage from relative safety with a reasonable chance of success. That shift from helplessness to capability may have been the bazooka's most important contribution. The weapon proved that innovation didn't require years of research and billions of dollars. Sometimes it required an engineer walking past a scrap pile, an open-minded supervisor, and a willingness to try something unconventional. Skinner and Uhl were simply solving a practical problem with limited resources and urgent deadlines. That their solution became one of the war's most influential weapons demonstrates that effective solutions don't always require complexity. The bazooka stands as testament to American innovation under pressure. It wasn't perfect or sophisticated, but it worked well enough, cheaply enough, and quickly enough to help win a war. The soldiers who carried bazookas into combat rarely thought about historical significance. They thought about survival and protecting fellow soldiers. The bazooka was simply a tool, but it was a tool that transformed them from victims of mechanized warfare into warriors who could fight back. That transformation, repeated hundreds of thousands of times across every theater of World War II, was the bazooka's real legacy.